Hi there, welcome back to the postmortem series for Color Jumper. This time around I wanted to talk about the music for Color Jumper, which is a very, very big aspect of the game for me because primarily I am a musician. So there was a lot of pressure on me to get the music just right in a lot of different ways. But I wanted to talk about kind of the timeline for the music, how it came together, and interestingly, the soundtrack actually was inspired by pretty much one sample, which I want to talk about a little bit later. So initially I wanted to talk about the demo of the game, which only had 3 songs. And of those 3 songs, 2 of them actually made it into the final version of the game. The first one is the introduction/menu song. And primarily the introduction pretty much just introduces the melodic elements to the overall game itself. I wanted to have something kind of light and airy and flowing without feeling like overburdened, because a lot of the soundtrack for this game, I wanted it to be more on the calm side than on the aggressive side, because playing this game can be frustrating. The second song that made it into the final version of the game was the credits song. In this song, I felt like I wanted to take the core themes of the main melodies, but make it more fun, more like a credits song, like celebratory. And that was a lot of fun to take what I currently had for the main menu and then switch it over and just like make it real upbeat and happy. It was a lot of fun to do that. Finally, and this is the song that didn't make it into the final version of the game, is a 2-hour track challenge that I did called Layered Like a Cake. And while I liked this song, it didn't really go for the feeling that I wanted overall. It was way too ambient. There wasn't a lot of percussion, and when it was very heavy-handed. So eventually I just decided that I didn't want to do that. But it stayed in the demo because I didn't have time and I just wanted to put the demo out there. And I wanted, very, very specifically, I wanted the audio or the music in the game to have layers, to have like a chill, calm layer, and then like an advanced or active layer, and then like a heavy action layer. In Color Jumper, there's actually 4 layers total, but I think in the demo there was only 3. And I find that adding layers of audio to games is very, very important. I love doing this with games. I've done it with a lot of different game soundtracks that I've worked on. Primarily The Maker's Eden, which is kind of a chill, noir, down-tempo style music, but it has an ambient layer, it has an exploratory layer, and it also has an action layer. So depending on where the player is at the current moment, the music actually reflects that. So it's kind of a subtle indicator of how the player should be feeling at the current moment. So I wanted to do that in Color Jumper as well. And while it's not super hard to get that implementation in there, it took me a while to kind of fine-tune how I wanted the musical layers to shift. In the original game, in the demo version of the game, it was by level. So after you beat like levels 1 through 5, then levels 6 through 10 had an additional layer. So basically, as you advanced through the stages, the music got more and more intense over time. However, when it came to the actual release of the game, the final version, I went for something that was a little bit more intricate, and that was based on player deaths. So basically what happens is every time the player dies, I increment a value by 1. And when that value gets too high, I think it was chunks of 15, then it switches to a more aggressive version of that song. And since there's 4 layers, the player has to die over and over and over, and slowly the song gets more and more aggressive and upbeat and intense. And I really like how it all kind of came together with that. Eventually, if you die too many times, it goes from that very, very intense music back down to 0, back down to the chill music. So it's not just frustration, because it can be frustrating if the player is stuck on a level and the music just gets really intense and it just stays there for like 45 minutes. The primary goal that I had was that the music feels like it's evolving over time. So even though it's like a 3-minute loop, it kind of sounds like it's a 10 or a 15-minute long song that evolves through all of these different iterations of the same ideas. And so the music in the final game is actually broken into sections. Each section of the game is 25 levels long that ends in a boss fight. So I felt like the boss fight was a really good chance to switch soundtracks. So like levels 0 through 23 are like the section 1 soundtrack, and then there's a boss fight on level 24. And since we're already shifting the soundtrack from like the level music to the boss music, it's a really good opportunity to switch to a new soundtrack. So after the demo, I made most of the game, and then I started working on the soundtrack. At the time, the soundtrack was very heavily inspired by Vince Rubinetti, who's a friend of mine, and he makes these really cool, chill, like down-tempo ambient songs with this jazz fusion vibe, which I really, really dig. If you have the time, I would highly suggest checking out the soundtrack for Ink and the soundtrack for Hacky Sack. They're both really amazing soundtracks. So yeah, I wanted to do something like that because it had this electronic vibe, but it wasn't too in your face, and it had a lot of kind of smart time signatures and chord progressions and all of this really fun stuff that I love to do as a musician for games. But I kind of got hooked on just a single sample. And I wanted to go into that because really, it's kind of cool that this entire album was inspired by one sample. So let me go over to Ableton here. Okay, so here we are in Ableton. I wanted to showcase the sample that I found first. It's a very simple sample that goes by like intra-chord low. It was off of the Korg Monopoly by Lego Welt sample pack, and it is a simple G minor chord. Sounds like this. And if we wanted to hear that on a piano, there might be some like other harmonies in there as well, but primarily it's a G minor chord. So basically what happened was I had been listening to a lot of dub tech music at the time, which is a kind of a style of music that's electronic but very, very down tempo. The percussion is often very understated, and it turns into this kind of just wash of sound, and I really love how it sounds. I still love how it sounds, but at the time that I was making this soundtrack, I really loved how it sounds. I was listening to it quite a bit. So let me actually just load up the most chill version of this. Again, there's 4 layers per song, but this is the most chill layer. So yes, it's a lot of very, very, very slow and very simple chords that kind of build on a texture rather than like a progression for sound. And I think that it's very important. But this single sample actually went through all of it's kind of in the background for almost every version of this song. So in section 1, the sample was just by itself, but in section 2, we'll see that we transposed it up by 7 semitones. So it sounds quite a bit different. And then later on in the song, we're basically starting to chop it up. We're starting to move it around a little bit, which is kind of cool. And it doesn't persist through the whole song. There are definitely breaks where it doesn't play, but it's still there, which is nice. And then even in a later section for this here, it gets even more crazy. We start doing some pitch bends. We start messing around with it a little bit more. So we start messing around with how the chord kind of functions as just a chord, and it becomes more of an instrument in its own way. It becomes a synth. So we're not only messing around with how it's pitched, but how it is chopped together as well, and that's really cool. And then in section 3, we do even more of that, I believe. And if we solo that chord, or that sample. So we're turning it more and more into an instrument as we go on. There's a lot of hard pitch shifts which help kind of keep the same core sound of that sample, but it helps reinforce the melodies that happen around it. And then finally, in section 4, we go kind of whole hog with this, and we start to change things around even more with more chopping, with more sampling, and we actually kind of reverse it a little bit too, which is neat. So this is section 4. So instead of playing it as it normally does as an instrument, we're actually reversing it. So again, we're taking that core sample and we're messing around with it in very interesting ways. And as these sections, I'm only showing the most chill version of the section because that's the easiest time to hear that sample. But the more layers deep you go into the aggressive versions of these songs, they become more and more, the samples tend to get chopped up more or distorted more, and more crazy things happen from there. So I had a lot of fun working on this album. It was definitely a challenge for me, and one of the problems that I had with this was the fact that I kind of ran out of time to do it. I really made this album over the course of a month and a half, which is kind of crazy considering it's about 2 hours worth of music if you take each layer as its own song. And it's one of those things that's so frustrating for me as a musician for video game developers. People come to me and it's like, okay, I'm releasing my game in 2 months. I need a soundtrack like in a week, and and it's really difficult for me to do that. And I said that I wouldn't do that to myself. That's crazy. And then of course I did. I ended up deciding that November 1st is when I was releasing this game, and it was in September, I think, when I realized I still didn't really have music for it. So I had to scramble very, very hard to get the music together and out there. But I'm very, very pleased with how the soundtrack came out in the end. It's probably one of my favorite albums of last year, and it's probably one of my favorite albums to listen to it like way in the background when I'm working on some other types of art, like if I'm doing development work and stuff like that. It's so cool to have that in the background just because it's so chill. And I would highly recommend listening to just dub tech music in general because it's so in like the background, but it has a lot of cool textures and interesting things going on that really helps concentration for me anyway. So yeah, if you are interested in listening to this album, it is on my Spotify account, and I will have a link to that in the description below. Check it out, you might enjoy it. So yeah, this has been a lot of fun. The soundtrack for me was one of the keystones to Color Jumper. Like I said, primarily I'm a musician, and Color Jumper was one of the first games that I've ever made. So I wanted the music to be spot on, and even though there was a very limited amount of time for me to work on the soundtrack, I think that it came out very, very good. So if you have any questions about the soundtrack or Color Jumper in general, please feel free to ask me them in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to talk about the game and how the soundtrack came to be. Or if you wanted more information on like other samples that I use, like I know I focused primarily on that one sample, the rest kind of were all over the place for my standard fare of music. But I do plan on doing more post-mortem soon. I've had some questions on how I created the beam effects inside of Color Jumper, and I think that it's a really cool effect that I want to share with people, so there's definitely going to be something on that soon. Until next time, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I really, really appreciate all your support for Color Jumper and this channel in general. Please consider liking and subscribing and all that other stuff if you are interested in supporting the channel, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.